Chorus Voices, the podcast brought to you by Chorus, a fresh approach to community service. Settle in, listen in, and enjoy the voices who bring you reflections, musings, and stories from our community.
Hello and welcome to the third and final episode of our special loneliness series on Chorus Voices. I'm Lou Forster, Head of Brand and People at Chorus. So far we've looked at what loneliness is and why we feel lonely. We've heard from some incredible people who wanted to tell their stories about their experiences with loneliness. Loneliness is what we feel when we don't have a sense that we're connected to other people, when we feel isolated. People lose that connection for all sorts of reasons, including the death of a loved one, a relationship breakdown, losing a job, or even because they've moved away from family and friends. And that's where we start this episode. Today we're going to meet a couple of migrants, both of whom decided to tackle their loneliness head on and have, as a result, made a difference to thousands of people's lives. Because loneliness doesn't have to be forever.
I'm Emma Jarvis. I emigrated to Perth in 2007 with a 3-week-old, a 2-year-old and a husband that was FIFO. And it was probably the most vulnerable time of my life. My husband got offered a job in the mines and I was too pregnant to fly. So he came over and he was working in Kwinana and just rented a house in Mandurah. And then he came back for the birth of our son. So I flew over with a 2-year-old and a 3-week-old and a husband that was FIFO. And at the time we were, let's sink or swim, but I think I probably nearly drowned. I hadn't anticipated the cultural differences and I hadn't anticipated how hard it would be to get to know people in Australia. I used to go to parks and hang out and try and talk to the mums. I was living on one of those cookie cutter estates where people would drive into the houses and shut the garage. I remember in days talking to no one but the shopkeeper, and I hadn't anticipated that amount of loneliness. I think in the UK, where you're on buses, you're on trams, and maybe just familiar, or you've at least got some point of contact, or you can phone your mum or something like that. So it's incredibly isolating in a way that I didn't anticipate.
With the time difference, you can't always pick up the phone.
No, my family were very disappointed and angry that we decided to emigrate, and so that was a tricky time too in terms of that. And I think because Andy was in the mines 12-hour shifts, couldn't call him and say, actually I'm really struggling. I remember one time when I had food poisoning and I couldn't get up out of bed and I had to phone this lady I met at playgroup once and say, can you take my 2-year-old, because I can't do it, I can't get out of bed. And so the kindness of people in that, when you're that vulnerable, to make yourself open and vulnerable, and then to recognise people are kind and they're human, there was something really powerful for me in that, I think, that I'd not experienced before. Because I've always been resilient and I've always rested on my laurels, and I just couldn't.
That's interesting that it took you being so sick to reach out.
Yes.
And obviously you got her number, so you'd shared numbers, but had you not reached out much before with her?
Well, I'd only been in Mandurah about 6 weeks when I was so sick. So there wasn't that base of relationship. And I know when you go for the 6-week baby health check, you see the child health nurse and you fill in the questionnaire around postnatal depression. And as a social worker, I think you normalise it. Yes, well, I'm bound to be teary because I've just moved to the other side of the world and I've got a new baby, so actually I'm probably fine. So I think I contextualise things but falsely, if that makes sense. And I think when you're trying to get to know somebody and you go to a play group and people are polite but not necessarily welcoming, there's a reticence in terms of how hard do you try to make those friendships and how hard do you not. And so I think it's only at the point where I was really desperate, I was like, I've got no choice but to say, actually, I really need help today.
And did you stay in touch with that?
Yeah, we actually became friends, which was lovely.
The situation couldn't go on. Emma was determined to do something about her isolation, about the lack of connection with other people in her life. She decided to form a group to help other people in a similar situation to herself.
Well, after 9 months, I said to my husband, you've got 3 choices. We get divorced, you get a new job, or we go home, because this just isn't working. So we moved up to Perth and we joined a brilliant church community. And he got a new job in the city, so he wasn't flying fly out anymore. But when I was in Perth, I just realised there was lots of people in a similar situation to me. So I joined up with another expat and we set up a not-for-profit called Connect Perth. And the sole purpose was about welcoming newcomers, recognising how hard it had been for us. I think in Mandurah, the playgroup mums had only ever lived in Mandurah and had their sisters and their childhood friends, and didn't understand what it was like to be new, and didn't understand what it was like to not have that network. And when you fill in your forms and they say, who's your emergency contact, you literally have nobody in the country that can be your emergency contact. So we set up Connect Perth, and we did things like help newcomers unpack their trailers, and we did weekly meetings in the park, and I had people around to my house regularly, and we just tried to be the friend, or that point of help for the newcomer. And we did really well, and we went for about 5 years, and in the end we were getting referrals from people overseas moving to Perth saying, I've heard about you through word of mouth, because there was lots of medics that were coming for a year, or at that point it was the oil and gas boom. So lots of people kind of go and say, oh, this group was really helpful, go home, and then people from Germany talked about it, and so this German couple said, oh, we're coming out, can you help us, can you meet us? So it got really, it was very, very helpful to many people. But in the end, after 5 years, I got back into work, and at that point the boom went down, so there wasn't quite the need for it in the western suburbs. But it was very helpful for those that did it, and it just came at a point of, when you're vulnerable, you realise because what I learned was, people said, oh, have you been to the child health nurse? Have you been to such and such? I didn't want to go to services, actually what I wanted was a friend. So it came out of recognising that as humans, you want contact that's kind and genuine, not service delivery based. And so we just decided to be the friend to the people in need as opposed to the service to the people in need. And there's a difference in that, I think.
If you were to give yourself advice now, as you were just getting on that plane, what would it be?
I wouldn't say don't do it, because I'm so pleased I did it. But what I probably would have said is, don't change so much at the same time. So a new birth, a new country, and an absent husband was probably too much to all bite off at the same time. So don't chase your dreams at the expense of being sensible. It's okay to wait 6 months and wait for a different job, or it's okay to be a bit more cautious in the way you do it and less impulsive. But I think we were so desperate for adventure, we kind of flew into it, and then they went, oh, yeah, actually that's really hard.
And how did your husband go as well? Because I know you have, he had his work, I guess, peers around him, but
yeah.
Did he feel lonely, do you think, or?
He was so focused on work and so excited to be here, and the way he functions is he gets quite, he's incredibly focused, but that means he can get blinkered. So I think he would filter out information that didn't fit what he wanted it to fit, which is why I had to do the ultimatum in the end. And then he was like, all right. And then, oh yeah, I've been a bit of a brat.
I mean, you were so empowered to be able to just say that it's come to this. And I can't imagine someone that didn't have as strong a relationship or wasn't able to say it's this or this, and could just carry on in that struggling.
I think I was confident enough in our relationship to know it would go right and he would pick.
Loneliness isn't just a huge problem in Australia. In 2018, British Prime Minister Theresa May did something remarkable. She appointed Britain's first ever loneliness minister. With 13% of Britons feeling permanently lonely, including 1 million people aged over 65, Mrs May said the government had to do everything it could, quote, to bring an end to the acceptance of loneliness. That move symbolises a cold, hard fact. Loneliness can be overcome. You don't have to feel lonely. You might not have chosen to be lonely, but equally, you don't have to choose to stay lonely. If what's missing when we're feeling lonely is that sense of connection, then how do we create that connection?
Hi, I'm Jane Chilcott. I'm the CEO of Link West. Link West is the peak body for what we call neighbourhood and community resource centres. They are place-based, community-led organisations scattered across WA. There's 160 of them. Community resource centres are all regional and remote, and the neighbourhood centres have a number of different names: family centres, learning centres, and there's about 40 of those in the Metro Perth area and some scattered in the regions. And the key thing about our centres they are about bringing people together and social connectedness through multiple different activities and events like play groups, seniors groups, but what they do is they are places where people can connect and belong through positive activities and experience.
Jane Chilcott is a remarkable woman who has created something very special. The organisation she's chief executive of, Link West, has helped thousands of West Australians feel connected to their community.
So I was born in Zimbabwe and grew up in Zambia with a South African mum and an English dad from the Isle of Man. There's actually quite a few books now written about a population of people called third culture kids. And I was definitely one of those. And third culture kids are where you are like an expat child. You grow up in one culture and you don't belong there because you're not that nationality, you don't have permanent residency. So you have a passport for another country. In my case, I lived in Zambia, but I had a British passport. I only visited Britain twice, once when I was 5, once when I was 9, and then I went to boarding school there when I was 12. So I didn't feel British at all. And so I sort of belonged to this sort of third culture. And it wasn't until, we lived in Japan for a year, and I came across the terminology third culture kids.
And you said as well that your tribe that you kind of pulled together in France was English-speaking people from all over the world as well.
Yeah, so France was a really interesting experience because we went to Toulouse for my husband's work. He worked for Airbus, and Toulouse is a really interesting place because of Airbus. Airbus employs probably people, about 40 different nationalities, all in and around the Toulouse area. My kids were very little. They went to the local school in the village, and the total population was 700, but most of them was outside of the town. And it sounds really idyllic, we would walk through sunflower fields to go to school and pop in and buy baguettes and things, but it actually was incredibly lonely. And the kids were starting in maternelle, which is sort of 3 to 6. And nobody would talk to me, and I found it very difficult to sort of start conversations with the other parents because my French wasn't very good, which also meant that the kids were completely isolated because nobody wanted to invite them home to play, because then they would have to deal with me, even though my kids, particularly my eldest son's French was really good. And then because he felt so isolated, he would say to me, when we were approaching school, don't speak to me, I don't want anyone to know that we're English. And don't speak to me in French because your French is so bad. He'd say, "Maman, tu parles comme un bébé," you speak like a baby. So I'd have to walk silently, drop them off, and leave them because he was so sort of lonely at school. And then one day I was in the car park or something, and this French lady approached me and she said, there's a group of ladies that would like to learn English, but we can't pay you, it's a volunteer job, but we wondered if you would help us. I said yes, okay. And it turned out that it was basically like the village hall, the village community centre. The deal that we came to is that we would do 1 hour of English, me teaching them English, and then they'd do 1 hour of French, them teaching me French. And we became really, really good friends. And as a result of that, they then, our kids started playing together. They would help my children with their homework. I ended up bringing them all together and having sort of this cultural exchange where, people would try Vegemite or Marmite or frog's legs and it was actually, we had such a laugh, and it really did help to break down some of the barriers locally. And now when I look back, I realise it was a neighbourhood centre, because in the room next door there was people doing patchworking, and then there was a men's group that came in that played board games, and so it was just somewhere for people to connect and belong within this little village.
What was the difference in the relationship between your French-speaking mums and community that you met, and then the other English-speaking migrants, perhaps through the Airbus?
What's interesting is when I think about the French women that I bonded with in that group, they were all from out of town. So I didn't really ever get to know the people that were born and brought up in that little village, other than my immediate neighbour, Lily, who'd lived there all her life. But pretty much everybody else that within my sort of French friend network were actually new to that little village as well.
That sounds very similar to, in my experience,
Yeah.
like yours here in
Yeah.
Australia, being
Yeah.
a migrant. It's quite hard to meet and kind of break into the community of people that are born and raised in Perth.
Yeah.
Just you find your network now,
Yeah.
not it's Perth, unless you kind of stumble across someone through something else.
Yeah.
What was Japan like in that experience?
We arrived, my husband went out to work, we didn't have children. I'd given up a job as, quite a successful career to get there, so I was sort of feeling really lost. So I did a few things, like I volunteered for Tokyo English Lifeline, and I met a few people through that. But initially when I got there, I was just completely lost. And there's a Japanese newspaper, the Japan Times, and in that I saw that there was a Bible study group up the road. Now, I'm an atheist, but I was so desperate to meet people, I went to the Bible study group, and I only went once because I met a whole load of women there with young children, English speaking, and through one of them I heard about that it's a volunteer program where a local Japanese person, effectively they did a bit of a speed dating event, and they connected a local Japanese volunteer with an English speaking, mostly a foreigner. And then they sort of, their commitment was to spend a couple of hours with you, I think, every week, sort of introducing you to the culture, speaking the language. So sort of go to the shop, find out what you want, and then say, well, let's go and look around a supermarket, or we'll show you where you go and buy our kimono, or where we go and buy our special little cakes or whatever. And again, looking back now, that was a neighbourhood centre. There was all sorts of things going on there, and the whole purpose of it was to bring people together and for the community to, come together to make it a better place. Looking back over my life, how, through playgroups when my kids were little, that was how I met people and connected with people. So yeah, I am very passionate about our centres because they've made a huge difference to my life.
I think it's fascinating that the church group was whatever it takes, I'll just go and meet some people there.
That's right, yeah.
To me, that's a little bit about pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, because it could have been quite easy to just say, no, I'm not going to do that because it's not my thing.
Yeah. Oh, and also, I think, because I've moved around a lot in my life, I learned that very quickly that if I was going to meet people, I had to be the person that went looking, and I really realised that when my kids were at the local primary school in Perth, and I was dropping them off, and there was an Indian lady in a sari who'd stand at the edge of the school, and her little boy would run in every day. And I thought, that was me in France, and nobody spoke to her because nobody knew how to interact with her because she obviously didn't speak any English. And it was heartbreaking. Yeah, and I kept, trying to find a way of telling her where she might be able to go, because I knew about our centres then. But of course she didn't have transport, and I think there probably were other things going on there. But yeah, it really shows how isolating it can be if you don't speak the language. But even if you do, you can be pretty lonely.
Getting involved in your community through a community centre or a group, or perhaps through volunteering, is a great way to overcome a sense of loneliness and isolation. It can provide fantastic opportunities to meet new people, cultivate friendships and social interactions, and also to develop new skills. Through some of these activities, people can focus on developing quality relationships with people who share similar attitudes, interests and values. It's something we know works. We see it here at Chorus every day with the changes in some people that volunteer with us, and also in the people's lives that we support in our community. It's also something Jane sees every day, and not just in the people that come into community centres, but she's also seen it with her parents.
My elderly parents decided to migrate over here, and so I think my dad was 83, my mum was 75. My dad was quite sort of an academic, sort of nerdy kind of man, and so he'd always struggled a little bit socially anyway, and they arrived, whereas my mum has always done lots of sort of activities. So I took my mum, and actually I mentioned the glide-in and introduced her to the glide-in, and she joined a couple of art classes, and it just, transformed her life. And, one of the things that she loved was the knitting circle where they would knit for the salvos. And Sandra, who worked at the glide-in, said, the laughter coming out of that room was just infectious as they were all knitting away. Mum and Dad used to go to a foreign affairs speaking group, but Dad was pretty lonely, and so Mum mentioned this to one of her friends, who said, "Oh, my husband goes to the Frio Man Shed." So Paul came and picked Dad up one day and took him to the Frio Man Shed, and that just transformed Dad's life, because then he would go every week at the same time, from the age of about 83 he was, and they really valued him, and they gave him a sense of purpose. He was always given work to do. It's like sorting out the tools, and he's always been very handy. Yeah, and when he turned 90, by then he had definitely had dementia, and he was quite frail. And it was like, I felt like I'd picked up a child from playgroup. He was so proud because they'd baked him a cake, and they'd made such a big fuss of John the Pom. It was so beautiful. And then sadly Dad ended up in care with dementia not long after that, and it was the men from the men's shed that visited him regularly. It was just so beautiful, and came to his funeral and spoke about him. And honestly, I don't think he's had connection with other men like that for a long time since he worked.
A study of the community centres Jane talks about has shown they significantly reduce mental health problems and issues around parenting and social isolation for seniors, among a whole host of other positive impacts. According to a study by Swinburne University, nearly 30% of Australians don't feel part of a group of friends. A quarter of us feel we have nothing in common with the people around us, and more than half of us feel a lack of companionship, at least sometimes. Getting involved can help ease some of those feelings of loneliness. Before I go, I wanted to share 8 things some experts recommend we do if we're feeling lonely. 1, acknowledge the fact that we feel lonely. Don't be embarrassed about it. A quarter of us feel lonely, but acknowledge it and the need to do something about it. 2, engage in small talk. Go through the checkout and talk to the person on the till instead of using the self-service. Take your headphones out at the gym and talk to the people around you. Make those little connections that modern society seems to have lost. 3, try and be your authentic self. Don't conceal your personality or your quirks. Just be who you are. If you're more honest with people, you'll feel more confident, and what's more, the people that you want in your life will like you for your authentic self. 4, seek treatment if you need it or think you might need it. If you have underlying mental health issues that may be exacerbating your feelings of loneliness, you might need to get some help to enable yourself to flourish. 5, listen. Listening helps build relationships. As you start to get out there and get to know new people, listen to them and their stories. Ask questions. Be inquisitive. It will really help you connect. 6, try technology to alleviate isolation. The internet, social media, smartphones, they can be good or bad influences on our lives, but they can help us to connect with friends and family in a positive way, and it's worth trying them. 7, say yes to invitations and experiences. I had a friend who had a year of saying yes. Put yourself out there. If you feel anxious or nervous, then mentally prepare yourself by visualizing ahead of time. When you're there, make sure you're present, engage with people, try things. And 8, as we've already heard, try joining a group, whether it's a group for video gamers, a book club, movie club for the over 60s, or volunteering at our Chorus Kitchen. Find yourself some people with similar interests and perhaps shared values and get involved. And that's it for our special podcast series on loneliness, where we've talked about what loneliness is, why we feel lonely, and perhaps what we can do about the feelings of loneliness. Thank you to all the wonderful people who've shared their stories. Brett, Duke, George, Karen, Warren, Jessica, Emma, Jane, and of course our psychologist Abby. Thanks also to Dan Hatch, who worked on the production of this series and turned hours and hours of interview recordings into what I hope listeners have experienced as a meaningful journey about the experience of loneliness. So I hope you've enjoyed listening to this series as much as I've enjoyed making it. And if you want to find out more information about dealing with loneliness and isolation, we'll have some resources in our show notes. So until the next episode, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Chorus Voices, the podcast brought to you by Chorus. If you like our show and wanted to know more, check out our website at chorus.org.au. And please leave a review. We'd love to hear your feedback, and it helps others find us and enjoy the podcast as well. Join us next time for more inspiring stories and news from our community. Chorus, a fresh approach to community service.